Okay, welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to greet you all on the occasion of this book launch in form of a conversation. My name is Stefanie Schüler-Springom. I'm the Gerda Henke guest professor here at LSE and the German Historical Institute, and I have the honor to be the academic chair, which is much of an honor and very little work, because I was told I don't need to introduce anyone, because you all know, of course, Peter Barnes, the president of the British-German Association, and the author of this book that you see here in front, Frank Trentmann, who's a professor at history at Birkbeck. And a special thanks also to the Student Association, the British-German Student Association, who is sitting there, for also having part in this event. And having said this, I'm looking forward to a very inspiring evening, because I had the privilege of having read almost the whole book since Friday. So it's very fresh, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much indeed for that introduction, and we're delighted to be able to be here at the London School of Economics this evening. And good evening to you, ladies and gentlemen. A special welcome to members of our patron circle, and also to the LSE German Society at the back. This is the second of 3 events that the British German Association is actually organising this week. And if any of you are not yet members and would like to join us, please have a look at our website. And if you would like to buy this book and haven't yet done so, I think you should have been given a QR code when you arrived to make that purchase easier. Just a quick word on housekeeping. I will be in discussion with Professor Trentmann for about 45 minutes, and then hand over to Professor Schüler-Springom to chair the audience Q&A for the last 15 minutes. So if you have any questions you would like to ask, please think about what those might be. And apologies in advance that my voice this evening is quite weak, but I hope you can nonetheless hear me. I've myself read hundreds of books on Germany, and I have to say, Out of the Darkness is not the most comfortable book to read for people who have a view of post-war Germany as being an unqualified success story. But nonetheless, I find it the most insightful and thought-provoking book I've read on post-war Germany this year. So if you're short of ideas for Christmas presents, or wanting to suggest to other people what Christmas present they should buy you, I can only strongly recommend it. But may I start by welcoming you, Frank, and saying that prior to writing this book, you were primarily known as a professor of consumer issues with a British and global reach. So what was it that inspired you to write this book about post-war Germany?
So in autumn 2015, I had finished my last book, which is called Empire of Things, and which is a history of consumption. And one thread in that book are moral issues. So effectively, any society in the world, when it starts talking about consumers or consumption, it becomes a moral discussion. Is it excess or is it necessity? So I became quite interested in moral issues, and the book was finished with the publisher in autumn 2015, and that was, of course, when the so-called refugee crisis reached its peak. And I started noticing in German newspapers how so many topics, I mean the migration topic, refugee topic initially, but then also all sorts of other topics, were very quickly moralized, so given a moral tone. So not just what might be the correct response, but effectively always asking, are we good people? If we do this, are we still good people, or might we be criticized? And it was a very different tone of discussion from that in Britain or Italy. So I thought, well, I had done bits of German Germany in the previous book, I thought actually it would be quite interesting to think about where that comes from. And my initial hunch was what most historians, I think, would tell you, or what most people believe, is, well, of course, why are you surprised? There's all this guilt hanging over the German nation. And I started digging a little bit, and that idea started to fall apart or become more complicated. So that's how I got going.
The moral dimension of the book is even clearer in your German title, Der Aufbruch des Gewissens, the awakening of conscience. But you start your book in 1942, which struck me in a way as an odd year, given that it was the year of Operation Reinhardt, when almost 2 million Polish Jews were murdered. It was also the year in which another couple of million of Russian prisoners of war were being murdered in prisoner of war camps. What was it that led you to start the book in that year? And was there for you a moral turning point in that year which made you choose that year as a starting point?
Yeah, no, that's a very important question. I mean, historians, we carry that problem with us. You know, we constantly think about chronology, where to start, where to end. Many other scholars, sociologists, think, oh, what's all this fuss about? But for history, of course, it's very, very important, because you're setting down a sort of marker where you think developments acquire a new dynamic. So in this case, I very early decided that starting 1945 would be a mistake and also boring. There is this conception that 45 was a sort of hour zero, and then people pull themselves up by the bootstraps. But that doesn't really stand up. And then in the archives, I started reading diaries, letters, other records in the winter of 1942-43. So initially really around Stalingrad. And it suddenly became apparent that, you know, together Stalingrad and then ever-increasing aerial bombing in the course of 43 was shaking up sort of basic convictions and made, not all people, but some people, ask questions about what this war was really about. And so it's really a convergence that you have. On the one hand, you have the transition from sort of the so-called Holocaust by bullets, which you refer to extermination camps. That exists, I mean, that starts prior to Stalingrad and bombing, but it's Stalingrad and bombing that suddenly made people think, oh, perhaps there's a connection. And with bombing, I mean, it's you know, I have so many letters and diaries and only include a few, but basically there is a portion of the population which is asking, well, why are we being bombed? There must be a reason. Could it be that we were, in the language of the time, we were a bit too harsh with the Jews?
Yeah.
We perhaps shouldn't have deported them. I should add that that's the segment. So on the other sort of polar opposite, really, you have people saying, well, why is anyone surprised? That's exactly what Goebbels and Hitler have been saying. Of course we're being bombed because the Jews and the Bolsheviks are trying to destroy the German nation. So you alluded to the German title Aufbruch. It's not quite awakening, I would say. It's more sort of breaking open, so there are cracks appearing.
Yeah.
And people are, for the first time, considering that the war might not be won. And if the war isn't being won, what might happen to you at Judgment Day?
Right, yeah, that's very interesting. And in the era post-1945, Germany went quite quickly from being a defeated nation to the new Cold War starting, and the Soviet zone, which later became the DDR, being governed very differently from the Western zones, which later became the Federal Republic. How do you feel those different political structures altered the approach to the moral issues of the Second World War and the attempt at denazification.
No, it's very important, the beginning of the Cold War. I mean, actually, the immediate post-war years, I think, are much more fascinating than many people realize, because so much is in flux. So you have Allied tribunals, you have in 46, 47, you still have lots of Germans as prisoners of war. You have very high number of sentences, both in the western zones and in the eastern zones. And then 47, 48, there's really sort of a turning point, and you can see the beginnings of the Cold War settlement in which the two then start to diverge. I should say, though, because there is a sort of popular view that's expressed in some books that somehow East Germany dealt with this much better, that denazification was more successful, political justice was much more successful. I think that's partly true, but it depends on where in the state in East Germany you look. So East Germany was really tough on anyone who was in the way of collectivization or socialist control of politically important offices, so Ministry of Justice.
Yeah.
You go down to the level of, say, schools or the local police. Most teachers in East Germany were former Nazi party members, and same with police. So it's not an entirely unblemished record, but it becomes, by the early 50s, so 49, foundation of the Federal Republic, and Adenauer becomes chancellor. You can see sort of between 49 and the early 50s sort of a sharp dropping down of political criminal justice.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to come on to that period of the Adenauer Republic from 1949 to 1963. And I think what is remarkable is that even in the late 1940s, there was a perception amongst many Germans that the Nuremberg and related trials were a kind of victor's justice. So that when Adenauer came in as the first chancellor in 1949, he stopped a lot of prosecutions. He released a number of people serving sentences of 2 years or less from jail, and he talked about letting bygones be bygones. And then, even more remarkably, I think, during the Adenauer years, he used this phrase, you can't throw out dirty water when you have no clean water available, but he almost went out of his way to choose some of the most implicated people in senior positions in his regime. So famously, Hans Globke, who had written the Nuremberg laws, became his chief of staff, and Walter Römer, who had been the bureaucrat responsible for the execution of Sophie Scholl and the Weiße Rose movement, became a senior judge of public law. Do you think that it was inevitable that in order to achieve the Wirtschaftswunder, Adenauer had to use these very senior people who'd had positions in the Third Reich, or was there an alternative that would have allowed a greater degree of denazification and yet achieve the economic successes?
There are always alternatives in history. I mean, there are always roads not taken. Adenauer, I think, is really a fascinating figure, and perhaps one of the figures where I changed my view as I was working through this. So we have a certain sort of conception of the man, partly through the photographic record. Here's this sort of old man, very taciturn, very self-disciplined Catholic, who represents a sort of grey, comfortable but ultimately provincial type of Germany, and who led, as many people at the time said, a kind of conservative restoration. I think actually that's one shouldn't make too much of that. That was a party political argument, but that doesn't mean that Adenauer had to do what he had to do. I mean, we have comparative cases. So if you look at Belgium, for instance, Italy and France, you have a much tougher attitude. Many more of those implicated in the war and war crimes stay in prison or lose their civic rights, and so forth, than in Germany. And it's not that the rest of Western Europe is a basket case. They also had economic miracle. So you didn't necessarily need to do that. I think what we have to remember is that, it was a gamble that he took, but my view was actually he had grasped that by 1950, many people had serious sacrifices. So if you had been a Nazi official, say, you would have spent sometimes, often 2 years, 2.5 years in a prisoner of war camp. You would have lost, you would have been fined in many cases. So the initial attempt at compensation was those implicated in the Nazi regime should actually, through their own personal finances, pay victims. So that they had their knuckles wrapped. Many of those people never come back, in terms of regaining their social status. So good case, a Gauleiter, so a regional Nazi figure, who by 1950 is reduced to being a traveling salesman for liqueur, and his wife has to wash dishes in the local restaurant. No one in that town any longer looks up to that person. He's finished socially.
Yeah.
The people Adenauer brought back, I think Globke could have a long discussion. I think more important is that in the Ministry of Justice, in the Foreign Office, you have sort of 60 to 70%. So a remarkable continuity by that time. But by the 1950s, most of those people are really, really happy that they can still be part of a new state.
Yeah.
They will not run any risks. They're not, I think, a real danger to the democratic functioning of the state. Where there are a problem, and we know that from recent research, is that if you look carefully, people in the Ministry of Justice apply the same sort of Nazi colored view of social outsiders, marginalized groups, as they did in the 30s. So if you look at how Sinti and Roma are treated, how homosexuals are treated, it's a direct continuity.
Yeah, I'll come on to that a little bit later, but that's extremely interesting. If you look at Germany today, a lot of people compare Germany favourably with, say, Britain in terms of coming to terms with the crimes of the past. There's much more sensitivity in Germany to the Holocaust than there is in Britain to slavery or colonialism. But I think what is also remarkable is how slow that process was. So arguably, it wasn't until the Eichmann trials in Jerusalem in 1961 that Germany really started to come to terms with the Holocaust. And the word Holocaust itself was largely popularized by the American miniseries with Meryl Streep in the late 1970s. Do you think it's legitimate to say that a lot of this pressure to recognize the Nazi-era crimes was actually coming from outside Germany itself?
No, I wouldn't go that far. I also wouldn't. Obviously, if you take a very long-term view, the engagement with the past and the critical reckoning with the past is rising. But it's sort of waves. So it goes up and it goes a little bit down, and then you have Eichmann trial, and later 79, the American television series. But you have precursors, and I think they're important to recognize, and probably nowhere more so than in our moment right now. So in the early 50s, it was often civil society, what we would now call civil society groups, from the grassroots who were giving attention. So you have, in the early 50s, you have young Germans, so teenagers and people in their 20s, going, hiring buses and going to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp.
Yeah.
You then have the enormous popularity of the Anne Frank, not just the diary, but the play, which is performed all across Germany. Before the Eichmann trial, you have local trials where the community, through the trial itself, the hearings, but also through regional press, is alerted to massacres that took place, in the forest just back of the town. So you have growing engagement and growing irritation at Adenauer's amnesty and the continuity of personnel. It's a tug of war, which then is settled really by the late 70s. But I would always, perhaps because I'm not a 68er, so I sometimes get annoyed when the 68ers say, "Oh, we did it all. We alerted, we confronted our parents' generation." I think that's not true, actually. They were kicking in a half-open door, and you already have initiatives in the early 50s. I give one example, which has a personal note. So when I went to school, so I'm born 1965, and went to school in Hamburg. It was not until we were in the 9th grade or 10th grade, so I would have been, so this would have then been 1980, I suppose, 1980 roughly, that our history teacher said, "I think we should have a special showing of Nacht und Nebel."
Yeah.
So famous French documentary film of the Holocaust, which I think is from 1956, 1956 or 57. We're now 1980. And there was huge debate among the other teachers. This was a social democratic, progressive place I went. The parents, should we expose our 14, 15-year-olds? In the end, it was shown. And it was, of course, a huge shock for everyone. The same film was watched by Christian Democrats, young Christian Democrats, conservative youngsters in 1957-58 in club meetings, causing a debate, but also leading to a kind of reckoning with their parents. So these things come and go, and my generation had to probably come to terms exactly like people in the 50s.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's interesting that the generation that you're talking about is just after the miniseries is
That's right.
brought out. One of the other things I found fascinating in your book was the way in which you talk about different victim groups being treated differently. So quite correctly, there's been a huge emphasis on the suffering of Jewish people and remembrance of the Holocaust. But in your book, you talk about victims of racial, religious, or political persecution getting much more attention, much greater restitution than other groups who were, for example, forced labourers or badly treated in occupied countries, but who were not being persecuted because they belonged to particular racial or religious groups, but because they were part of, for example, the Generalplan Ost to use a lot of East Europeans as slave labourers, or the Hungerplan to deliberately starve large numbers of people in Eastern Europe. Do you think that those different treatments of different victim groups are changing in people's perceptions, and is it justified to treat different classes of victims differently in that way?
Well, I take your question as a historian would. So what I think should be done is sort of secondary to my interest in seeing how at different times the authorities and citizens gave different answers to this question. I think that's the interesting part of it. It also relates back to your earlier question about the importance of the Cold War, because one thing Adenauer leaves behind is a morally very difficult legacy in the way he handled reparations and compensation. So on the one hand, never in the history of the world before did a state take on such an enormous burden of trying to compensate victims as Adenauer did with the agreement with Israel and the Jewish Claims Conference.
Yeah.
You know, these are enormous, I mean, just in terms of money, these are enormous sums in the 50s and 60s and early 70s. So on that side, you know, it looks like a morally very important step in the right direction. But then on the other hand, the crimes were so vast that what the Adenauer Republic did is it singled out particular groups, leaving others completely neglected. So, and that includes the forced laborers, it includes people who didn't fall under the racial political persecution, it includes Jews who did not have any German connection. So there was a vast legacy also of unresolved problems. Yeah. If I may just add one aspect to that. I mean, one thing that has interested me is the politics, or the history of victim politics, if you want to call it that. So naturally, the Second World War leaves behind enormous numbers of victims in different groups. I think the mistake we sometimes make is we project backwards from our understanding of the Holocaust to the late 40s and 1950s. As you said, in the late 1940s, early 1950s, you know, there was knowledge of war crimes, but they weren't bundled together as the Holocaust or the singularity of the Holocaust. So what you then have is different victim groups, including German victims of aerial bombing, disabled soldiers, the returning prisoners of war, widows and orphans. They're all shouting. They're all shouting for attention. And I think the mistake we've made is when we've seen when they're shouting, their main motivation was to sideline the survivors. But I don't think that's actually true, partly because the number of survivors, I mean, Nazis murdered so many Jews, there are not that many survivors. What they're fighting with is each other. Yeah. They want the German state to help them back on their feet, and that means social assistance, housing, all these things. So there's a sort of competitive victim politics, and needless to say, Jewish survivors are in that hierarchy. They tend to be at the bottom together with homosexuals and Sinti and Roma.
For much of the period of your book, there was not just one Germany, but two Germanys for the 40 years between from 1949. And you characterize the German Democratic Republic, so East Germany, as being seen in two different ways. One as a Stasi state, which one's familiar from the film The Life of Others, and on the other hand, a nanny state providing subsidized housing, healthcare clinics, childcare creches, and so on. To what extent do you think that these two aspects of the DDR were complementary, that you needed both the carrot and the stick to hold the state together, or to what extent were they pulling in different directions?
No, they're absolutely complementary, and we need to see them as working with each other and through each other. So I think it's quite a mistake to try and separate from each other the surveillance state or the political dictatorship, and then on the other hand have a sort of kind of preserve of private life, everyday life, where people grow their cucumbers in the dachas and have a nursery place for their children. I mean, these two bits, they work with each other, and the dictatorship partly works because people are happy enough to resign themselves to having this little bit of privacy without challenging the surveillance, or indeed with going along, or turning a blind eye. So the one needs the other, it works the other. The other thing to say on this is that this view of what I call the nursery regime, where everyone just has nursery places, wonderful schooling, university places. A lot of that is plain nostalgia. So if you look at childcare, it wasn't really until the start of the Honecker years, so after 1971, that the regime really invested in childcare, and that wasn't to help children, but it was to get more women to add to their various other labors by working in factories. Before that, 50s and 60s and early 70s, you have one constant chorus of complaints from mothers. And the other thing is the disabled people, as they are not part of a functioning worker and peasant society, but they're disabled, they're completely ignored. Elderly people, completely marginalized. I mean, some of the stories are heartbreaking. So this view of the nanny state is partly a construct that we need to understand through the lens of the 1990s, so after the wall came down, when East Germany underwent an enormously turbulent social economic shock.
So I want to come on to that period. And I mean, at the time, German reunification was widely celebrated as the culmination of the post-war settlement. But as you correctly say, it didn't work out as well as people had hoped for a lot of people in East Germany. So the result of the currency unification on one-to-one terms was a lot of jobs, working people moving to the West. And even now, so 40 years later, despite the significant investment through the controversial SOLI, the extra tax to pay for East Germany, there are still very few people in senior positions, either in politics or in business or in government, who've come from the East. And some people, like a recent author, Katja Hoyer, argue that de-Stasification, so the sort of taking out of the top layer of East German society, was actually much more thorough than denazification had been in the 40s and 50s. Where do you see, what factors do you see as having prevented the realization of the coal vision of blooming landscapes in East Germany?
Well, that's a very big question. On the de-Stasification, I mean, I would have to find the page. I don't want to do that right now. But I think the interesting thing actually is the number of people who was Stasi, seriously incriminated Stasi officials who have been sentenced. I think you can count on one or two hands. So it's not actually that many people. The army, the army gets depleted. That's true. A lot of anger among former lieutenants suddenly not having a job, and judges suffer. But directors of schools go on, regardless of party membership or having worked for the Stasi. I mean, there's serious judicial and legal issues involved as well. But overall, I think the interesting thing actually is how little was done. But the difficulties, I mean, in East and West Germany, they're not primarily, I mean, they're social economic contrasts. So East German, what used to be the GDR, has barely any big companies. So it's mainly small companies, family firms, things like that. That's one very, very big difference, and that has knock-on effects on investment. It has a much smaller share of export industry, which is the engine driving the German economy. But if you look at people's, the statistical side of people's daily lives, so life expectancy is now almost the same. Income is also, the gulf is narrowing. Education, very, very, very similar. But regardless, you have deep frustration. And the frustration has more to do with, I would say, a cultural and psychological sense of not being heard, of not having the challenges people had to undergo after 1990 recognized.
Yes.
So that's, I think, hugely important. The other big difference is politics. People know about populism and right-wing politics. What I think is more important is sort of further down, sort of at the grassroots level. So after 1990, Kohl and his party and his allied party won overwhelmingly. But down in the towns and at the communal level, the West German parties completely failed to establish themselves as popular parties. So I remember when I looked at I tried to see, election results. Let's look at party membership, I thought. Let's see how many people actually belong to the CDU or the SPD or the Greens in Saxony and Thuringia. And I found sort of tables, and I first thought there must be on the top of the table somewhere in hundreds. But no, it is literally something like 80 people, or well, perhaps 900 or so. But it's tiny, so you had a vacuum, you have a political vacuum, and then under stress, that vacuum is much more easily taken over by extremist groups. Yeah. Not that there aren't any extremists in West Germany, but you have the established parties still.
Right. I'd also like to pick up an interesting difference in social attitudes that you allude to between the democratic and federal republic. So what you say is that under the democratic republic, abortion was generally possible, and homosexuality, although technically illegal, was very seldom prosecuted. Whereas in the Federal Republic, the paragraph 218, which allowed abortion in the first 12 weeks, was not brought in until 1995. The section 175, which banned homosexuality, was not revoked until 1994. And you even quote, although I think attitudes to disability were probably similarly prejudiced on both sides, but you quote a West German court case where a hotel guest successfully won compensation because a disabled person was allowed to stay in the hotel and was seen as ruining his enjoyment. What do you think accounts for the relatively late growth of tolerant attitudes in the Federal Republic?
Some historians would now respond, well, how late is actually West Germany? Look at other European societies. They're also not always tolerant. But I think you have a point. I mean, there is, it's interesting how in West Germany, in a constitutionally democratic society, you have these pockets of illiberalism. Yeah. And some of these pockets are, in fact, just sort of carryovers of fascist or quasi-fascist views from the 1930s or 1940s. So you mentioned the woman who wants her money back from the tour operator because there was a disabled person sitting at the next table at breakfast. When you look then carefully at how people talk about disabled people, I have a group of young women in the also sort of 1970s, early 1980s, who were asked by Catholic social investigators in a Catholic area. In a Catholic area, they're asked by a social investigator, "What do you think families should do if they give birth to a disabled child?" And of the 7 or 8 people with whom they have what we might now call a focus group, only one person says, well, I think the parents should look after that child, and that's a sort of Christian duty. All of the others come up with responses which are effectively sort of Nazi euthanasia. Yeah. So many of these values traveled on, and I think that's probably where the Adenauer years come in, that you have a broadly institutional democratic culture. Here and there you have initiatives to bring democratic debate, pluralism, diversity into society. These initiatives exist, but obviously they're working against a backlog left over from the 30s and 40s.
Yeah. A couple of last questions from me before we hand over to the audience. So the first I'd like to ask is on German attitudes towards climate change. So I think Germany is remarkable in having arguably the most influential Green Party, or one of the most influential Green parties in Europe. So since the Greens entered the Bundestag in 1983, there have been no new nuclear power stations built. It was largely under pressure from the Greens in Baden-Württemberg that Angela Merkel introduced the Energiewende in 2011, which phased out nuclear power stations. And yet you say that the average German now produces 8.5 tons of CO2 equivalents a year, more than the European average, and roughly 4 times the Paris 2030 targets. And since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which cut off a large number of supplies of German gas, there's been as big a push to replace those gas supplies as there has been to accelerate the production of renewable energy. So how consistent do you feel German attitudes are towards climate issues? And do you have a sense that German people, perhaps any more than British people, are prepared to pay the price that is necessary to adapt their lifestyles to enable the planet to survive?
Well, looking at the audience, I think we can ask some members of the audience how much they're willing to sacrifice. I think this wrestling with wanting to be good, but at the same time trying to hold on to comfort and security runs through the entire book. So climate policies and attitudes and actions towards climate change are just a particularly prominent current version of this internal struggle. And the way, I think, in the last 2 decades, really, German society and politics have tried to resolve this is by putting all their faith in technology. So have turbines, more turbines, more solar panel, and that will, or heat pumps, and that will solve it. You don't actually have to do anything. I mean, that's the mantra that comes from Berlin. And that's where the current Greens are quite different from the early Greens. And the early Greens, if you go back and you read their manifestos, it's in bold letters where it says, we've reached a crisis, modernization can't continue, we need to start a completely different way of life.
Yeah.
What we have now is, actually we have a pretty good way of life, let's try and hang on to it, and just be a bit more efficient and have a battery-driven car from a diesel car. Yeah. I think that's the difference, and the backlash Habeck, the minister, the economic minister, had for his suggestion of having heat pumps. Enormous. I mean, where in the world have you ever had big political debates with people in the streets about heating, heat pumps? But that shows, I think, just how little flexibility there is, even with technological innovations, if they either cost a lot of money or they complicate your existing arrangement. So I wouldn't say Germans always had a problem with making sacrifices. I mean, the book is full of making sacrifices, but we've reached a point with climate change where the willingness to not just buy a new technology, but to think you could live just as well or even better, differently, that has narrowed, and that's a problem.
I can see that. One last question from me. So you finished your book in 2022, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but before the recent Israel-Gaza war and before a number of different election results. And in your book, you wrote about the AfD, and I quote, the good news is that right-wing populism in Germany has been limited, its rise halted. Nationally, the AfD stands at 10% and is isolated. According to recent opinion polls, the AfD is now standing at around 21%, and in some of the East German Länder, almost at a third. Are there different conclusions you'd have reached in your book if you'd been writing it now compared to a year ago?
I mean, on the AfD, I mean, not at the last federal election, but the election before that, if you scratch in the Western states, if you look at Bavaria, for instance, the AfD had, I think, 20 or 22% in Niederbayern, Lower Bavaria. So the AfD has, it's not that the recent result comes out of nowhere. I do not believe, I mean, people, and the British press in particular, very quick to talk about earthquake. This is an earthquake, or compared to Weimar. There is a difference between having 15% in a regional parliament and two extremist party having over 50% in 1932. There's a real difference. The AfD, I mean, the recent results, I think, point to two things. One is the ability to attract protest voters. So I do believe the AfD has also in many areas of Western Germany, a sort of now core constituency of between sort of 8 to 12% of people who are genuinely populist and far right leaning. The add-on they managed to get in Hesse and Bayern, I think, is mainly protest voters, and that's the real problem. And someone said to me, I think rightly, well, perhaps that they have, the name has a point. There is no, for many voters, they don't feel there is an alternative, because German politics has become so center-oriented. The Greens are now part of the establishment. They're part of the center. So if you're really fed up with, I don't even know, over 20 years of this sort of central drill, well, what do you do? And the AfD is harvesting that. While it's not just an Eastern party, it's going to be, I think, very interesting and worrying if the AfD manages to win 1/3 of the vote in Saxony and Thuringia. Well, can you seriously, as a democratic party, whether you're a Christian Democrat or Social Democrat, can you seriously say, we're not going to talk to you? I mean, they would represent 1/3 of the vote.
Or even form a government.
Or form a government.
Well, thank you very much. I'm now going to hand over to Professor Springorum to ask some questions herself. And I think there is a roving mic.
We'll have one question for me and then... thank you so much. I mean, I think we could have listened much more, but I also am happy to jump in. Actually, I have two questions, but I will leave one for later on. I want to go back to the 1950s, and I want to go back also to the discussion on the title. I still don't know which title I like better. I think the English one, because consciousness is such a heavy word, as if there had been no consciousness before.
Conscience.
Yeah, that's true. But that's what I meant. Gewissen. You are describing these positive developments, the small positive developments in the 1950s, and I'm not talking about now of the reckoning with the past, but of becoming democratic, and that students could go to study in the US or school exchange in the churches, etc., etc. But I wonder, when I was reading this, and also this meeting, like houses for young people to meet and debate and here and there, for me it was very much Weimar. So where is the democratic tradition of the Weimar Republic or the democratic tradition of the workers' movement kind of disappears in your narrative? And I mean, our head of state is very fond of the 1848 revolution and wants to kind of recuperate its tradition. I don't think we have to go so far, but especially the I mean, especially from the social democratic parties and especially in the big cities, there was a huge movement of social work, of social engagement, and of a lot of very progressive things that that it took ages to get back to, like in the 70s and 80s. So how would you, very much in general, how would you evaluate the influence of old Weimar, positive traditions from Weimar, which was only 12 or 15 or 20 years past, in your narrative?
No, very good. Well, Weimar is important, I think, at two main levels. One is constitutional principles in politics. So many of the fathers, but also the mothers of the Constitution, had been politically socialized into democracy in the 1920s and had various offices. So I think that's at the top. From the bottom, I do talk about the Falcons, the Arbeiterwohlfahrt, the workers' welfare movement, which is very big, getting back on its feet in the 1950s. And I think the main, where that story leads, and is very, very important, is actually through the peace movement. So connecting an older social democratic and also pacifist tradition, youth movements, which by the 1960s has alliances with young students who often come from more middle class backgrounds. So the Easter marches, if you think of that, which then really becomes the fulcrum for the anti-nuclear protests in the 1970s. So I think that's where a lot of that drive goes. I have a bit on the trade unions. I think they're important. They're a bit hard to make them exciting, I would say. Trade union committee meetings, but they do matter.
Very much so. Okay, there was one question, and then behind. You need the mic, probably. So take them maybe both together, and then. And for the sake of all the others, maybe short questions, so we can have many questions.
Hi, thank you very much. Super interesting. You started talking about the denazification, and really interesting the statistics of the number of people in power who had been taken out of the system in the East and in the West. How do you think this equates to denazification on a kind of communal level, in the psychology of the people? Is there an argument to say that actually, if you can put the guilt on a minority, if you feel you've been cleansed, it absolves the individual, which has happened in one side more in the East and perhaps in the West, where, as you described, there was a counter-movement against the parents because there was a feeling they're still in our midst, and therefore much more an internalization of guilt.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, is that a concept, or whether there's been any research in that area?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you want to take two? Or?
Maybe the next one, and then. Yeah.
Hi, Dan Large, German Association. Two things. You were talking about sort of selective, or almost tokenistic attention paid to various groups that have been persecuted by the National Socialist regime under Adenauer's reign, I think we'll call it. One that struck me incredibly was when I was at university in Leipzig. I had a jolly nice time. I drank lots of beer. I lived next to a basketball court, and I had absolutely no idea until last year, some 20 years later, that was actually the main train station which the Zwangsarbeiter were brought into Leipzig in. And absolutely nothing, apart from one block of concrete with a bit of etching on it. They can't even find money to translate their own research. Yet I read 2 days ago about the 1.1 billion euro settlement between Germany and the communities in Namibia who were affected by the genocide in 1870. It strikes me as very odd what Germany picks and chooses, not just immediately post-war, but now we're much later on. And the GDR did nothing about it as well. Yeah, and also 175. That wasn't a sort of let's not pick them. That was an active decision to force these men to continue their serving of their sentence in the Zuchthaus after concentration camp, after they were concentration camp inmates and had been abused horrifically there. For this to go on to 1994, when we were introducing civil partnerships.
Could you move to a question, please?
Yeah. How do you square all this in terms of your, well, we pick this group, we pick that group, and whilst Germany is effectively trying to be readmitted to the human race after the genocide, it still picks on very large minorities in European society.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I mean, on the first question, we have some sort of local history studies of what happens in provincial small towns, and what's interesting there is that normally these towns or villages, they pull together after 45. So it's not so much were you a Nazi or were you not a Nazi, but were you an outsider or were you an insider? And the gut assumption with which people work is, my father was already business partner with his father, or my cousin was married with the neighbor. Somehow we'll have to get through this together, and we need to work together. So if the Nazi was a local, it's very likely that the local board would have just classified him in a generous, liberal way. If the person, however, was an outside bigwig, he probably would have been sentenced and punished. So it's the power of, I would say, pre-existing social solidarity that rules out. On the gentleman's point, I think it's very important to recognize that just as much as we're not dealing with a success story when it comes to politics and the economy, because there are environmental consequences, there are illiberal spots, also with memory politics, it's not all going in one direction. There are groups that are deliberately missed out. Germany's colonial history was not part in any of my school books, and indeed, I'd be surprised whether it's now part in all states. So there has been some recognition. People have been trying to get attention to this, but it's really late if you compare to British debates and so forth. Sometimes, I just want to make one point, because sometimes it's then assumed there must be a causal relationship, and people then start to make sort of slightly worrying arguments where attention to the Holocaust must have taken attention away from other groups, as if this is sort of a deliberate masking of other types of, in this case, colonial crimes. I think that's empirically just not true. So from the late 60s into the 70s and 80s, if anything, people start talking too loosely about the Holocaust. The Holocaust is compared to the Vietnam War, for example. The Holocaust seems to be everywhere. And Holocaust memory has also helped to give attention to other kinds of genocide, like the Armenian genocide. So it's not, a cause and effect relationship, but you're absolutely right. There are many blind spots that are only slowly getting attention.
So the gentleman, I have 3 more questions, and then I think we should slowly come to close. The gentleman here.
Thank you. Thanks. That was an excellent discussion, by the way. Thank you. Professor Trentmann, I'm going to ask a slightly unfair question. If you, for a historian...
We only take fair questions in this university.
If you regard your book as an 80-year trajectory, where do you think Germany will be in 40 years' time?
Okay.
Are you an optimist or not? Thank you.
Thank you. I want to come back briefly to your comments regarding the AfD. Now, we have a new movement in the making, a new party in the making with Sarah Wagenknecht. And we have to yet see how that plays out, but it looks like it has a nationalist kind of footprint and also a socialist standpoint. It's a bit of an unfortunate combination. Do you think that party is likely to suck away support from the AfD, or indeed likely to have a major impact on politics in Germany?
Okay. Take the third question.
Thank you. You were talking about the pressures from within Germany to denazify, at the same time, the necessities of using people with essential skills, both for the economy, but also in terms of the defence of Germany and NATO. How much do you see the American influence in respect of people like Gerhard Barkhorn or Richard Galen being employed, Barkhorn perhaps less tainted as a Luftwaffe pilot and general, but Galen particularly, both in terms of his work under the Nazis and then latterly?
Okay, I'm going to move in time. In time, I start with that observation. There is, of course, I don't think we should be surprised that in the Cold War, whatever works is being taken and party membership is kind of ignored. What's actually interesting is that the very early Bundeswehr, I think in the first 5-6 years, had pretty strict rules on who could not be in any senior officer position, which is then only watered down in the 1960s. So in a way you have more not very nice people from the Second World War coming back in the early 60s than were in the first year. But the fact that America is keen on that, of course, makes it much easier for Adenauer. Adenauer had this good, you already had one of Adenauer's quotes about you don't throw out dirty water if that's all what you have, which is always, coming from Hamburg, this is a Rhineland wisdom, and you think, well, why is this such a good quote? Because, surely dirty water, carries all sorts of diseases. Why do you want to hold on to it? But no, the other good line Adenauer had when he pushed through, really, against massive opposition and popular opposition, he pushed through the introduction of the new army. He said, well, I don't think the Americans will really be very happy if I offer them officers who are still wearing short trousers. So you had to somehow fall back. The new party, or Bündnis, I think as it's called, the Sarah Wagenknecht. Sarah Wagenknecht was born in East Germany, in the GDR, joined the socialist ruling party just before. I think she was probably the only one who actually joined the SED in the last few months of the regime, and then later on became one of the figureheads of Die Linke, which has managed to commit suicide effectively as a left-leaning alternative. And you're absolutely right, Wagenknecht, if the term wasn't already taken, she would be called a national socialist. So it's a combination of conservative, patriotic, anti-migration, and a social interventionist state and social reform. The question is whether she can really pull it off. I mean, I was in Germany until last week, and almost any sort of political analyst I talked to made the point that to start a party, a new party in Germany, is really difficult. I mean, you need organizational skills, you need resources, you need volunteers. Basically, you need to be having bureaucratic skills. What Wagenknecht has is charismatic skills. So great on the television, but that may not be good enough to actually run a party and recruit people and make them do what you want to do and have party discipline. So my hunch, as a historian, for what it's worth, is that yes, she will run, she will also get some votes. A lot of them would actually take away from the right-wing AfD, because Wagenknecht doesn't have fascism hovering over her, so she's a bit more an acceptable face of being anti-migrant. But in 2 or 3 years' time, her Bündnis will have fallen to pieces and she will be absorbed probably. She may herself go to the AfD, but that I don't see this being a viable long-term party, which leaves the big question, you know, which party or which movement will be able to attract voter sentiment that is left of the center. And that's why Wagenknecht is seen as this dark horse, because she's realized, you know, there are all these social issues left over by the Social Democrats. People feel ignored. So that, I think, is actually, and that's why it's not Weimar. I mean, you have strong populist right, but effectively you have no left. 40 years from now, I do think that in 40 years, Germany will have had to learn to play more of an independent, responsible role in world politics. I think it's highly unlikely that in 40 years they can still call Washington and say, can you please sort this out for us? I don't think that's going to happen. The big question, I think, is, in addition to Israel right now, is China. So the current government, and I think society as a whole, has been happily doing two things at the same time. One is trying to, you know, plead for moral values in international politics. Human rights violations should be, you know, should be talked about. But on the other hand, they've become ever more entangled in the Chinese economy. And with the German economy right now stalling, I find it hard to believe that enterprises will just pull out. Rather the opposite. And that then, if you know, there are people here in the room who study international relations who are much better qualified than me saying anything. But I do believe if you assume that the rise of China will continue, then Germany will really be squeezed, either having to follow its economic current interests or standing up for the principles which are in its constitution and which it believes it should be defending internationally. And you can't be both. Or to put it very briefly, I'm glad I'm not the German Foreign Secretary.
And we are glad that you're a historian, I would say. So thank you very, very much, Frank, also to be so courageous to, you know, be like looking into the future, which historians normally answer with, no, I'm a historian, I will not say anything about in 40 years' time. Thank you, Peter Barnes, for hosting this or co-hosting this, and thanks to all of you for coming. And yeah, thank you so much.
Our thanks to the LSE for allowing us to hold this event here, and to the many people at the LSE German Society who've been involved in the organisation. For those of you who are BGA members, we have our next event tomorrow on disinformation and democracy. It's an online event, so we look forward to seeing some of you there, or to our event later this month on German baking with Jürgen Kraus. So, but in the meantime, thank you again to